Hacker News Weekly Top 10 Stories, September 21, 27, 2025. Introduction. Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's Hacker News Roundup. We've sifted through 206 stories posted between September 21st and 27th to bring you the absolute cream of the crop. The 10 stories that got the community most fired up, generated the most discussion, and honestly, might just change how you think about the tech world we're living in. This week, we saw everything from the ongoing degradation of the web's most basic services to heartwarming indie games, from EU surveillance overreach to life wisdom from a 90-year-old tech pioneer. We're going to take you through it all, and trust me, by the end of this episode, you're going to have some strong opinions about where tech is heading. Let's dive in with a story that perfectly captures the frustration so many of us are feeling with the modern internet. All right, switching gears here, our next story really struck a nerve with the Hacker News crowd, and honestly, I think it's going to resonate with pretty much anyone who uses the internet. It's titled, "Everything That's Wrong with Google Search in One Image." And wow, did this one blow up. We're talking over 1,200 points and more than 700 comments. So here's what happened. Someone searched for Midjourney, the AI image generation tool that everyone's been using to create those wild artistic images. And get this, the actual Midjourney website didn't show up until the fifth result. Fifth. We're not talking about some obscure query here. They literally typed in the exact name of the company, and Google buried the real site under 4 paid advertisements. And this is where it gets really interesting, because it perfectly captures this vicious cycle that Google has created. The author points out that companies now face this bizarre situation where, imagine you've built this amazing product, right? You've done everything correctly. Great SEO, tons of legitimate backlinks, people love your service. But that's not enough anymore. Now you have to pay Google for ads just to appear above your competitors who are also paying for ads. It's like this endless advertising arms race where the only real winner is Google. What really got me about this story was how the author framed it. They ended their post with "sad" and talked about making search great again, which, it's deliberately invoking that political rhetoric, but it kind of works because this has become such a universal frustration. Google search has somehow become a populist issue that affects literally everyone who uses the internet. The discussion thread is where things got really spicy, though. You've got people sharing all sorts of horror stories about deceptive ads. Like, apparently, if you search for Firefox, you might get Opera ads at the top. Search for Amazon, Temu shows up. It's gotten so bad that some users are reporting actual scams. There's this whole thing about Canada's ETA visa system where fake sites are charging 10 times the official government fee, and they're appearing as sponsored results on Google. One commenter made this really poignant observation. They said they've been using the internet for decades. They consider themselves pretty savvy at finding information online, but lately, it's become dramatically harder to find accurate, useful information. Think about that for a second. We have more information available than ever before in human history, better technology, supposedly smarter algorithms, and yet, actually finding what you're looking for has gotten worse. Now, to be fair, not everyone could reproduce the exact issue from the article. Some users said when they searched for Midjourney, it showed up right at the top for them. This suggests the problem might vary based on your location, your search history, maybe what Google knows about your likelihood to click on ads, which is almost more disturbing when you think about it. It means Google might be showing worse results to certain users because it thinks it can monetize them better. The community's been exploring alternatives too. Perplexity and Kagi keep coming up as paid options that people are actually willing to fork over money for, which really tells you something about how bad the situation has gotten when people are literally paying for search engines to escape Google's ad-infested results. Though someone did point out that even DuckDuckGo has its issues with useless eBay links cluttering up results like it's 1999 all over again. But here's what really gets me. This isn't just about search. Users are pointing out this pattern across all of Google's properties. The Play Store is apparently a mess of sponsored apps. YouTube's recommendation algorithm is optimized for engagement over quality. And don't even get me started on what they've done to Google Maps with all those sponsored pins. It's this fundamental tension between Google's need to generate revenue and the basic utility of search as a service. And right now, it feels like the revenue side is winning, and we're all losing as a result. The fact that this story generated over 700 comments tells you everything you need to know about how much this is frustrating people. We've reached a point where just Google it might not be good advice anymore, and that's actually kind of a big deal for how we navigate information online. And speaking of the degradation of digital services, this connects directly to our next story about YouTube's escalating war on downloaders. All right, so here's something that's got the tech community pretty fired up. The story about YTDLP and their upcoming new requirements for YouTube downloads. This one pulled in over 1,200 points and 600 comments on Hacker News. And honestly, once you dig into what's happening here, you'll understand why people are so worked up about it. So YTDLP, for those who might not know, is basically the Swiss Army knife of video downloading tools. It's what a lot of us turn to when we need to grab videos from YouTube and, well, pretty much anywhere else on the internet. But YouTube's been playing this increasingly complex game of cat and mouse with downloaders, and now we've hit a pretty significant escalation point. What's happening is that YTDLP is being forced to adopt Deno, that's a JavaScript runtime similar to Node.js, just to handle YouTube's new anti-download measures. And this isn't because the developers wanted to make things more complicated. YouTube is now requiring downloaders to execute their entire JavaScript player code instead of just extracting simple tokens like they used to. It's like if you needed to assemble an entire car engine just to get the key to work, you know? The technical folks in the comments are really diving into why this is such a big deal. See, YouTube's basically weaponized JavaScript here. They're not just obfuscating URLs or adding some encryption. They're requiring you to run complex, constantly changing JavaScript code that only makes sense in the context of a full browser environment. One commenter explained it pretty well. They said YouTube's moved from, here's a locked door, to, here's a door that only opens if you can solve this Rubik's Cube while juggling. And by the way, we change the solution every few hours. But here's where it gets really interesting and kind of frustrating for a lot of users. Multiple people in the discussion are reporting that they're actually YouTube premium subscribers. They're paying customers, and they still need to use YTDLP because YouTube's official download feature is so unreliable. One person mentioned they couldn't download their own kid's school play that was posted as unlisted. Another said the official offline feature just stops working randomly, especially when you actually need it, like on a flight. There's this whole thread about content preservation that really struck a chord with people. Folks are increasingly worried about the ephemeral nature of online content. Videos disappear, channels get deleted, companies go under, and if you can't download and archive things, they're just gone forever. Someone brought up how they've been building their own media server, downloading everything they care about because they don't trust it'll be there tomorrow. And honestly, given how many times we've seen services shut down or content vanish, can you blame them? Now, there's an interesting contrarian view in the discussion that I think deserves some attention. Some folks are suggesting that YouTube might actually secretly want downloaders to keep working, at least to some degree. The theory goes like this. YouTube has something like 3 billion users globally, many of whom are using ancient devices or have terrible internet connections. If downloading becomes completely impossible, these users might just abandon the platform entirely. So YouTube does just enough to look like they're fighting piracy for the lawyers and rights holders, but not so much that they completely break accessibility for huge chunks of their user base. The comparison with TikTok came up a bunch, and it's pretty telling. TikTok apparently just lets you right-click and download videos. Simple as that. Meanwhile, YouTube's creating this elaborate technical arms race that's pushing developers to essentially embed entire browser engines into their tools. One commenter called it the JavaScriptification of everything, and yeah, that feels about right. What really comes through in this discussion is this sense of exhaustion with how the modern web works. Everything's becoming more complex, more locked down, more dependent on running untrusted code from massive corporations. A tool that used to be a simple Python script now needs an entire JavaScript runtime. And for what? To watch videos that in many cases people have already paid for the right to access. The technical solutions people are proposing are fascinating too. Some are talking about using actual browser automation, like Puppeteer or Playwright, to just pretend to be a real browser. Others are discussing distributed systems where different people run parts of the JavaScript and share the results. It's turning into this whole underground railroad for downloading cat videos and educational content. You know what's wild? This whole situation really highlights the tension between corporate control and user autonomy on the web. YouTube wants to control exactly how, when, and where you consume their content. Users just want to watch videos on their own terms, maybe offline, maybe archived, maybe on devices YouTube doesn't officially support. And caught in the middle are tools like YTDLP, trying to bridge that gap while navigating an increasingly hostile technical landscape. The DNO requirement isn't live yet, but when it drops, it's going to be a pretty significant change for anyone who relies on YTDLP. If you're someone who archives content, downloads videos for offline viewing, or just likes having control over your media consumption, might be worth paying attention to how this develops. Because if YouTube succeeds in making downloading impossible, it won't just affect the pirates, it'll affect researchers, archivists, educators, and yeah, even paying customers who just want their officially purchased content to actually work reliably. All right, so here's something that's really getting under developers' skin lately. Our next story is titled, "You Did This with an AI, and You Do Not Understand What You're Doing Here." And wow, has this struck a nerve with over 1,100 points and more than 500 comments on Hacker News. So this whole thing kicked off when someone submitted what was supposedly a security vulnerability report to curl. You know, the command line tool that's basically everywhere. But here's the kicker. It was completely AI-generated nonsense. Not just poorly written or mistaken, but literally a fabricated vulnerability that didn't exist. The maintainer could tell immediately it was AI-generated, and they were, let's just say, not happy about it. And honestly, I get why this is so frustrating. What we're seeing here is basically a new form of spam, but it's hitting open source maintainers and security teams where it really hurts, their time and trust. One commenter described it perfectly as a DDoS attack on maintainers, except instead of overwhelming servers, it's overwhelming actual humans who are trying to do real work. The discussion in the comments is fascinating because it goes way beyond just this one incident. People are sharing stories from all over. Bug bounty programs getting flooded with AI-generated reports, support teams drowning in fake tickets, even code contributions that look reasonable at first glance, but are actually complete gibberish when you dig in. There's this pattern emerging where someone uses ChatGPT or Claude to generate something that sounds technical and authoritative, submits it without actually understanding or testing it, and then, here's the really wild part, when they get called out, they often double down. They'll use AI to generate defensive responses, creating this bizarre situation where maintainers are essentially arguing with someone who's just copying and pasting AI outputs. What's particularly interesting is how this mirrors what's happening in education right now. Several teachers chimed in saying they're seeing the exact same behavior, students submitting AI-generated work across every subject, from creative writing to calculus. And when confronted, instead of admitting it, they'll often insist it's their own work or claim they just used AI for grammar checking. There's this erosion of, professional integrity, academic honesty, basic respect for other people's time. Now, there was an interesting counterpoint in the discussion. Some folks argued this isn't entirely new. There have always been people submitting bogus bug reports, either because they don't understand what they're doing or they're trying to game bug bounty systems for quick cash. The The difference now is the scale and sophistication. AI makes it trivially easy to generate something that looks legitimate on the surface, so the volume has exploded. One solution that came up, which I thought was pretty clever, is treating this like email spam. Someone suggested charging a fee to submit bug reports, maybe 50 or $100, but then refunding it if the report is legitimate. It's like a proof of work system, but with actual money. Would it work? Hard to say, but the fact that people are brainstorming these kinds of solutions shows how serious the problem is becoming. The broader implications here are honestly kind of depressing. We're watching the degradation of technical communication in real time. When you can't trust that a bug report is real, that a code contribution was actually tested, or that the person you're talking to even understands what they're saying, it breaks down the whole collaborative model that open source and really modern software development depends on. And you know what really gets me? It's not even that people are using AI tools. Those can be incredibly helpful when used properly. It's this lazy, disrespectful approach of just throwing AI-generated content at the wall to see what sticks, without any regard for the human beings on the other end who have to deal with it. These maintainers, they're often volunteers, doing this in their spare time, and now they have to wade through this sea of synthetic garbage to find the real issues that need fixing. The curl maintainer's response was basically, "I know you used AI, you clearly don't understand what you're talking about. Please stop wasting my time." And honestly, good for them. Maybe we need more of that direct pushback to make people think twice before hitting submit on their AI-generated nonsense. But here's where it gets really interesting: the economic angle that several people brought up. Someone pointed out that we've essentially created a society where participating in small organizations has become a luxury. Think about it. 50 years ago, one income could support a family, leaving time for civic engagement, volunteer work, running the local PTA or Lions Club. Now, both parents are working, everyone's exhausted, and the opportunity cost of spending Tuesday night at a town council meeting is just too high. One commenter put it bluntly, when you're barely making ends meet, volunteering becomes something only the wealthy can afford. And then there's the technology paradox here, which I find absolutely fascinating. We've got people arguing both sides. Some folks are saying, wait a minute, what about all these online communities? They're pointing to Slack groups, Discord servers, subreddits. Aren't these the new small organizations? There's this commenter, Software Doug, who's basically saying we're being too pessimistic. They're arguing that small organizations haven't disappeared, they've just transformed. Your local knitting circle might be dead, but there's a thriving online knitting community with thousands of members sharing patterns and techniques. But, and this is a big but, others are pushing back saying these aren't really the same thing. A subreddit with 50,000 members isn't a small organization, even if it feels intimate. And more importantly, these online spaces exist at the pleasure of massive corporations. Reddit can change its API pricing and kill thousands of communities. Discord can alter its terms of service. Facebook can tweak an algorithm. The power dynamics are completely different. There's this really thought-provoking comment about how software itself has become a force multiplier that inherently favors large organizations. A small local business can't compete with Amazon's logistics software. A community newspaper can't match the algorithmic content distribution of social media giants. The tools that enable scale have become so powerful that being small is increasingly a disadvantage, not just in business, but in every aspect of organizational life. What really caught my attention was someone bringing up the volunteer fire department example. These used to be everywhere. Small towns across America had their own volunteer departments, run by locals, funded by pancake breakfasts and community fundraisers. Now they're being consolidated into regional services, professionalized, centralized, more efficient? Maybe, but something's lost in that transition, that sense of ownership, of community self-reliance. And, the platform choice here is kind of poetic. Tao posted this on Mastodon, not Twitter or Facebook. Mastodon itself is this decentralized network, this attempt to create something that isn't controlled by a single large organization. It's almost like he's using the medium to reinforce the message. The conversation also touched on something I think about a lot: the winner-take-all dynamics of modern society. Several commenters noted how, in almost every field, we're seeing this concentration, where a few large players dominate and small organizations either get absorbed or just can't compete. Whether it's retail, media, banking, healthcare, the pattern repeats, and each time it happens, we lose those middle institutions that used to provide both economic opportunity and social cohesion. But here's the thing that nobody really had a good answer for. What do we do about it? Some people suggested policy changes, antitrust enforcement, supporting local businesses. Others seemed more fatalistic, seeing this as an inevitable result of technological progress and economic efficiency. One particularly interesting take was that maybe we need to consciously choose inefficiency sometimes, that the most economically optimal solution isn't always the best solution for society. The whole discussion really makes you think about what we've traded away for convenience and efficiency. Yeah, I can get anything delivered to my door in 2 days, but what happened to the local hardware store where the owner knew your name and could tell you exactly which bolt you needed for that project? We've gained so much, but what have we lost in the process? And speaking of governmental control and surveillance, that brings us to an even more concerning story about what the EU is planning. All right, so our next story is something that's got the hacker news community absolutely fired up, and honestly, for good reason. The EU is pushing forward with something called ChatControl. And folks, this is a big deal. We're talking about legislation that would require every single messaging app, yes, including the encrypted ones like Signal and WhatsApp, to automatically scan all your private messages for illegal content. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wait, how can they scan encrypted messages? And that's exactly the problem. This isn't just some minor privacy concern we're talking about here. This would affect 450 million Europeans with no way to opt out. None. Zero. And get this, it would override national constitutional protections for communication privacy. The EU is basically saying, those privacy rights you thought you had? Yeah, we're going to need those back. The stated goal here is to detect child sexual abuse material, which, look, nobody's arguing against protecting children. That's not the debate. The issue is that they're proposing to eliminate digital privacy for literally everyone in order to do it. It's the classic think of the children approach to legislation, but taken to an extreme we haven't really seen before in a democratic society. What's particularly frustrating, and the hacker news crowd really latched onto this, is that the politicians pushing this don't seem to understand the technology they're trying to regulate. There's this Danish minister, Peter Hummelgaard, who's been championing this proposal, and multiple commenters pointed out that he doesn't actually understand how end-to-end encryption works. He's proposing to fundamentally break the security model that protects not just casual conversations, but also journalists' sources, lawyer-client communications, medical discussions, basically everything we consider private in the digital world. And here's where it gets really interesting from a technical perspective. You can't scan end-to-end encrypted messages without breaking the encryption. It's not like there's some magical backdoor you can create that only the good guys can use. Once you create that vulnerability, it's there for everyone. Hackers, foreign governments, whoever. The math doesn't care about your intentions. The community reaction has been overwhelmingly negative, with over 600 comments and more than 1,000 upvotes. People are pointing out the obvious workarounds bad actors would use. They'd just switch to GPG encryption over email, or use steganography, or any number of other tools. Meanwhile, regular citizens would be living under constant surveillance. One commenter made a really sharp observation. The politicians pushing this have specifically exempted themselves from ChatControl. Funny how that works, right? Now, there was one interesting contrarian view in the discussion that's worth considering. One user suggested that while they don't support this particular proposal, we shouldn't be absolutist about privacy either. They pointed to China as an example where citizens have accepted certain surveillance trade-offs for perceived safety benefits. Not saying we should follow that model, definitely not, but they're arguing that as technology evolves and threat matrices change, the calculus might shift. It's an uncomfortable thought, but maybe worth wrestling with?
What really gets me about this whole situation is the persistence. This isn't the first time the EU has tried something like this. They keep coming back with these surveillance proposals, just repackaged with different names and slightly different approaches. It's like they're hoping that if they keep pushing, eventually people will get tired of fighting back. The technical community is especially frustrated because they see this as politicians who don't understand technology making decisions that would fundamentally break the internet's security infrastructure. Several commenters pointed out that this would likely kill European tech innovation. Why would any secure messaging company want to operate under these conditions? Signal has already said they'd rather pull out of the EU entirely than comply with something like this. And you know what's really wild? This regulation would be what they call the strongest and most binding legal instrument in EU law. It would automatically apply to all member states, no voting, no national debate, just boom, mass surveillance for everyone. That's not exactly the democratic process most Europeans signed up for. The broader implications here are staggering. If the EU, which likes to position itself as a champion of privacy rights, goes through with this, what message does that send to more authoritarian regimes? Hey, even the Europeans are doing mass surveillance now, so it could set a precedent that undermines privacy protections globally. Look, protecting children is crucial. Nobody's debating that. But as many commenters pointed out, this approach is like burning down the entire forest to catch one criminal hiding in the trees. The collateral damage to civil liberties, to democracy itself, it's just too high a price to pay. And ironically, it probably wouldn't even be effective at its stated goal, since the actual criminals would just move to other platforms or encryption methods that aren't subject to these scans. This story is definitely one to watch. The EU Parliament is supposed to vote on this soon, and the tech community is mobilizing hard against it. If you care about digital privacy, and honestly you should, this is the time to pay attention. All right, so our next story is something that really caught fire on Hacker News, and that's that Secret Service SIM farm story is bogus. And honestly, this one's got me a bit fired up because it touches on something we see way too often in tech reporting. So here's what happened. The Secret Service comes out saying they've uncovered this massive national security threat, right? They found what they're calling a SIM farm, basically thousands of cell phones all rigged up together, and they're making it sound like they just stopped the next big cyber attack on America. Major news outlets, including the New York Times, picked this up and run with it, citing anonymous government sources, talking about threats to UN facilities, potential attacks on cell towers, the whole 9 yards. But here's the thing, and this is what the article's author is pointing out. This is almost certainly just a regular old criminal operation for sending spam texts or maybe forwarding international calls. You know those random texts you get about your car's extended warranty? Yeah, that's probably what this is for. Hell, it might not even be criminal. There are legitimate businesses that use setups like this as gateways between VoIP providers and mobile networks. What really gets me about this whole situation is how it perfectly illustrates this pattern we keep seeing. Law enforcement finds something, doesn't really understand what they're looking at, and immediately jumps to national security threat because, well, that gets headlines, doesn't it? That gets funding, that gets attention. The way they supposedly found this thing is actually kind of telling. They were investigating some threats that were sent to politicians via SMS, and instead of actually tracking down who sent the threats, they used radio triangulation and just found these SIM farms. It's like if you were trying to find who robbed a bank, and instead you found a parking lot full of cars and declared victory because, hey, the robber probably used a car at some point, right? Now, the community discussion on this was fascinating because it really split into a few camps. You've got people who are completely on board with the skepticism, saying this reminds them of those overblown hacker busts from the 90s where someone with a few pirated games would be portrayed as some master cybercriminal threatening national infrastructure. Then there's this really interesting debate about journalistic ethics that emerged. See, the author goes hard after the New York Times for using anonymous sources, basically saying they're just acting as a propaganda outlet for the government. But some commenters pushed back on this. There's a user named Goshen who makes a pretty compelling argument that anonymous sourcing is a legitimate journalistic tool when done right, with proper editorial standards and verification. They're saying the article oversimplifies what's actually a complex issue in journalism.
And you know what? Both sides have a point here. Yes, anonymous sources can be crucial for getting important information out there, especially when we're talking about government operations or corporate wrongdoing. But when those anonymous sources are government officials speaking on the condition of anonymity to discuss an ongoing investigation, which is exactly what the Times cited, and they're pushing a narrative that makes their agency look good, that's when my skepticism radar starts going off. There's another interesting angle here that user Pika Frost brought up. They pointed out that criminal enterprises and nation-state activities aren't mutually exclusive. Just because something's being used for spam today doesn't mean it couldn't be repurposed for something more serious tomorrow. Though, honestly, if a nation-state wanted to attack our infrastructure, I'm pretty sure they've got more sophisticated methods than a room full of burner phones. What really bothers me about this whole thing is the pattern it represents. We've got government agencies that seem more interested in generating scary headlines than accurately describing what they found. We've got major news organizations that are either unwilling or unable to push back on these narratives. And caught in the middle, we've got the public trying to figure out what's actually a threat and what's just hype. The technical details here matter too. A SIM farm like this, thousands of phones all networked together, that's not some sophisticated nation-state tool. That's the kind of thing you can find tutorials for online. It's what scammers use to make it look like they're calling from local numbers. It's what spammers use to blast out millions of texts about crypto investments or fake package deliveries. Calling it a national security threat is like finding a crowbar and declaring you've stopped a bank heist. And this is where the media criticism really lands for me. When journalists just repeat what officials tell them without asking basic questions like, how do you know this was for attacking infrastructure? Or what evidence do you have that this is anything more than a spam operation? They're not doing journalism, they're doing stenography. The whole thing reminds me why places like Hacker News can be so valuable. You've got actual technical experts in there saying, hey, wait a minute, I've seen these before. This is just, and then explaining what's really going on. That kind of ground truth from people who actually understand the technology, that's what's missing from so much mainstream tech reporting.
So yeah, next time you see a breathless headline about some massive cyber threat that law enforcement just stopped, maybe take it with a grain of salt. Ask yourself, are they showing actual evidence of what they're claiming, or are they just pointing at some technology they don't understand and shouting, danger? Because from what I'm seeing here, the real danger might be in how easily these narratives get accepted and amplified without proper scrutiny. Now, let's shift to some more human stories, starting with something that really touched a nerve about our social connections. All right, so our next story is something that really struck a chord with the Hacker News community. It's called Always Invite Anna, and wow, did this one spark a conversation. Over 1,100 points and a really thoughtful discussion about something we've all probably wrestled with at some point. So here's the thing. We've all been on both sides of this, right? You're either the person organizing events and wondering if you should keep inviting that friend who always says no, or you're the one declining invitations and secretly hoping people don't stop asking. The article essentially makes the case that you should keep inviting people even when they repeatedly decline. And man, the community had some fascinating takes on this.
What I found really compelling is how many commenters opened up about their own experiences with depression and social anxiety. There's this recurring theme where people are saying, look, when I was going through a rough patch, I said no to everything, but knowing people still wanted me around, that mattered. One commenter mentioned how they declined invitations for months during a depressive episode, but those continued invites were like little lifelines reminding them they were still part of something. But here's where it gets interesting. Not everyone agrees this is the right approach. There's this commenter, Beetlebee, who makes a pretty practical point. They're saying, hold up, after 3 to 5 invitations with no response or all no's, you gotta draw a line. And honestly, they're not wrong about the scalability problem. If you've got a growing social circle, at what point does being the perpetual inviter become emotionally exhausting? They argue it creates this unhealthy dynamic where one person is always doing the emotional labor. And then there's Shock9889, who brings up something I hadn't considered. They're basically saying that if someone has social anxiety and you keep inviting them to the same type of group events they're uncomfortable with, you're not actually being helpful. Maybe what Anna needs isn't another party invitation, but a one-on-one coffee catch-up, you know? It's this idea that true inclusion means adapting your approach, not just persisting with the same strategy. The organizer's perspective really resonated with me too. Multiple people talked about how draining it can be to always be the one reaching out, facing rejection after rejection. There's this emotional toll that comes with being the social glue, and I think we don't talk about that enough in our increasingly digital, often isolated world. What's fascinating is how this seemingly simple social etiquette question reveals so much about modern loneliness, mental health, and the effort required to maintain human connections in an age where it's so easy to just disconnect. The tech community especially seems to grapple with this. We're often introverted, we work remotely, we communicate through screens, and yet we still crave that human connection. The consensus seems to be leaning toward continued inclusion, but with nuance. It's not just blindly sending invites into the void, it's about reading the room, maybe adjusting your approach, checking in differently. Some commenters suggested things like explicitly saying, no pressure to respond, or making it clear that the invitation is always open without requiring a response each time. You know what really got me? Several people mentioned that sometimes the invite itself is the gift. Even if they can't come, knowing they're thought of, knowing they're wanted, that can mean everything to someone who's struggling. It's like leaving the porch light on. Maybe they won't come home tonight, but they know they can. Speaking of perspective and human experience, let's hear from someone who's had 9 decades to think about all this. All right, so switching gears completely here, let's talk about 9 things I learned in 90 years. This absolutely fascinating piece that's been lighting up Hacker News with almost 1,000 points and hundreds of comments. And what makes this particularly special is that it's written by Edward Packard, who you might know as the guy who basically invented the Choose Your Own Adventure books. Yeah, that Edward Packard. Now, unfortunately, the PDF itself seems to be having some accessibility issues right now, but the discussion around it has been incredibly rich. Here's this 90-year-old author reflecting on nearly a century of living, and the tech community is having this really nuanced debate about wisdom, success, and what it all means. What's striking is how divided people are about this kind of life advice. On one hand, you've got folks saying we massively undervalue the wisdom of elderly people in our society, especially in tech, right? We're so obsessed with the next new thing, the young founders, the disruption. And here's someone who's lived through the invention of television, the space race, personal computers, the internet, smartphones, basically every major technological shift of the modern era. That perspective is invaluable. But then there's this really interesting pushback from some commenters. There's a user named Gilbatron who raises this provocative point. They're basically saying, look, a lot of these successful people spend their whole careers grinding, ignoring work-life balance, chasing achievement. And then in their twilight years, they turn around and tell everyone to seek peace and contentment. Is that survivor bias? Are we hearing from the ones who made it through that grind intact while ignoring all the people who burned out along the way?
And this touches on one of the major themes that emerged in the discussion, the role of luck versus effort in life outcomes. Some commenters are arguing that successful people, especially those who make it to 90 with their faculties intact and the ability to reflect and write, often underestimate just how much random chance played in their journey. It's not just about working hard or being smart, it's about being in the right place at the right time, having the right connections, avoiding that one car accident or health crisis that could have derailed everything. Then, there's this fascinating philosophical debate that broke out about happiness as a default state. Packard apparently advocates for this idea, but a commenter named Shark1 comes in citing psychologists who argue this is actually a modern myth. They're making the case that unhappiness isn't a bug, it's a feature. It drives us to grow, to change, to seek meaning. Without dissatisfaction, would we ever push ourselves to achieve anything? You know what really gets me about this whole discussion, though? It's happening on Hacker News, a community that's typically focused on the cutting edge, on building the future, and yet here they are having this deeply human conversation about what it means to live a good life. There's something poignant about tech workers, many of whom are probably in their 20s, 30s, 40s, grappling with advice from someone who was born in the 1930s. And the Choose Your Own Adventure connection adds this whole other layer. Here's someone who spent their career creating books where readers could explore different paths, see where different choices lead. And now, at 90, they're looking back at the one path they actually took. There's a beautiful symmetry there.
The discussion also touched on this tension between living for success versus living for contentment. It's the classic question, do you optimize for achievement or for happiness? And can you really separate the two? Some commenters are arguing that the peace and contentment Packard might be advocating for now is only possible because of the achievements and financial security from earlier in life. It's easy to say, don't chase money when you're not worried about paying rent, you know? What I find most valuable about this whole conversation is that it's forcing people to confront these questions explicitly. In tech, we're often so heads down, focused on the next sprint, the next release, the next funding round. And here's this 90-year-old voice saying, essentially, I've seen how this movie ends, and here's what actually mattered. Whether you agree with his specific points or not, that perspective shift alone is worth wrestling with. Now, speaking of perspective and digital identity, our next story takes a much darker turn. All right, so our next story hits pretty hard. It's titled, Delete from Users Where Location Equals Iran. And wow, did this one strike a nerve on Hacker News. Over 900 points and nearly 800 comments, and for good reason. This is a first-hand account from an Iranian software engineer who's basically been digitally erased from the tech world, not because of anything they did, but simply because of where they were born. And the SQL query in the title, that's not just clever wordplay. It's literally what's happening to Iranian developers across major platforms. So here's what went down. This developer had created an app called EyesGuard on the Microsoft Store, and one day, poof, Microsoft just deleted everything. The app, their entire developer account, all the user reviews and comments, just gone. No warning, no explanation. They tried reaching out to support and got completely ghosted. And look, we all know about sanctions, but this is where it gets really messy, right? Because we're not talking about blocking some government entity here. We're talking about individual developers trying to participate in the global tech community. But Microsoft was just the beginning. Notion took things to another level of harsh. When they detected this person was in Iran, they didn't just block access, they permanently wiped all their personal data. And here's the kicker. Notion explicitly told them that even if they moved out of Iran, they would never, ever restore that data. Think about that for a second. That's not enforcing sanctions anymore. That's basically saying you're permanently tainted by your birthplace. And then there's this guy, Mike Cardwell, who runs his own website and decided to block all Iranian IPs with this incredibly hostile message blaming Iranian citizens for their government selling drones to Russia. Like, imagine being an Iranian developer who probably disagrees with their government more than anyone, and you're getting personally blamed for geopolitical decisions you have zero control over. The Hacker News discussion on this is fascinating because it really exposes the complexity here. Several commenters pointed out that U.S. executives can face up to $1 million in fines and 20 years in prison. Yeah, 20 years for transacting with sanctioned individuals. So you can kind of understand why companies just hit the delete button immediately when they detect an Iranian IP address. They're terrified. And honestly, with penalties like that, who can blame them? But here's where the conversation gets really interesting. A bunch of commenters started pointing out the double standards at play. Like, we in the West are really good at saying, hey, don't blame me for what my government does, but then we turn around and collectively punish Iranian citizens for their government's actions. One commenter made this brilliant point. The US and UK are actively arming Israel, which many consider controversial, but nobody's deleting American or British developers' accounts over it. And get this, the EU actually has the complete opposite stance. They have what's called blocking statutes that make it illegal for EU companies to comply with these US sanctions on Iran. They've been actively working against these sanctions since the 1990s. So you've got this bizarre situation where a company could be breaking the law by serving Iranian users in the US, but breaking the law by not serving them in the EU. What really comes through in the comments is how Iranian developers have become inadvertent networking experts. They're dealing with their own government censorship from the inside while simultaneously being blocked by Western services from the outside. They're having to use VPNs just to access basic development tools, which, ironically, makes them look even more suspicious to automated systems looking for sanctions violations. One of the most thoughtful threads in the discussion was about whether these tech sanctions actually work. Like, are we really weakening authoritarian regimes by preventing their citizens from using Notion? Or are we just pushing talented developers who might be allies in promoting democratic values further into isolation? Several Iranian commenters chimed in saying these sanctions actually help their government by giving them someone to blame for economic problems. The whole thing really makes you think about digital human rights in a new way. When so much of our professional and personal lives exist online, being cut off from these platforms is almost like being stateless in the digital world. And unlike physical sanctions that might end when regimes change, these digital blacklists seem to follow people permanently, even if they leave their country. There's this underlying tragedy here that really resonated with the HN community. These are fellow developers, people who love technology and want to contribute to open source projects, build cool apps, participate in the global tech community. And they're being systematically excluded, not for their actions or beliefs, but for the passport they hold. The author of the original post sounds so frustrated, but also resigned, like they've just accepted that this is their reality. You know what's wild? In all those 799 comments, there wasn't really anyone defending the current system as good or effective. Even people explaining the legal realities acknowledged how broken this all is. It's one of those situations where everyone can see the problem, but the intersection of laws, liability, and geopolitics has created this Gordian knot that nobody knows how to untangle. And finally, let's end on something a bit lighter, a reminder that not everything in tech has to be dystopian. All right, so shifting gears from enterprise tech to something way more fun, let's dive into this WebGL game that's got Hacker News absolutely buzzing. It's called a WebGL game where you deliver messages on a tiny planet, and wow, has it struck a chord with the community. Over 1,000 points and nearly 200 comments, which for a browser game is pretty remarkable. So here's the thing, I couldn't actually access the game myself at messenger.abeto.co. The site seems to be having some issues, maybe getting hugged to death by all the HN traffic. But the discussion thread tells such a fascinating story that I had to share what's happening here. From what the community's describing, this is essentially a journey-inspired multiplayer experience that runs entirely in your browser. You're on this tiny planet, think Little Prince vibes, delivering messages to other players. And apparently the artistic execution is just chef's kiss.
People are throwing around phrases like masterclass in game design and absolutely beautiful, which you don't hear every day about browser games, right?
What's really getting the developer crowd excited, though, is the technical achievement here. This thing apparently runs smooth as butter on mobile devices, which, if you've ever tried to run complex WebGL content on a phone browser, you know that's no small feat. One commenter said, "It literally made me excited about the web again." And another developer mentioned they're specifically impressed by the WebAssembly implementation. It's one of those projects that reminds you that the web platform has gotten incredibly powerful. We're not talking about simple Flash games anymore. This is sophisticated 3D rendering with multiplayer networking, all without installing anything. But here's where it gets interesting, and this is such a perfect example of how polarizing game design can be. While most people are gushing about the aesthetics, there's this contingent of users who are absolutely struggling with the camera controls. One user compared it to, and I quote, "a bad PC port of Sonic Adventure," which, ouch. That's a deep cut for anyone who remembers those early 3D Sonic games and their notoriously wonky cameras. The camera apparently has this tendency to randomly rotate, especially on mobile, and some users reported actual motion sickness. One person had to quit despite loving how beautiful the game looked because they kept getting stuck on invisible walls and fighting with the controls. It's fascinating because you've got people in the same thread calling it a masterpiece, while others are rage quitting from frustration. There's also some technical quirks showing up. Safari users on macOS are reporting glitches, which, classic Safari, if I right? Always the odd one out when it comes to web standards. What strikes me most about this whole discussion is how it highlights this ongoing tension between game development and artistic vision and accessibility. You've created this gorgeous, technically impressive experience that clearly resonates with a lot of people. But if your camera system is making players physically uncomfortable or preventing them from actually playing, have you succeeded or failed? It's not a simple answer. The multiplayer aspect seems to be a huge part of the appeal, too. People are comparing it to Journey, which, if you remember, had that brilliant anonymous multiplayer where you could only communicate through musical chimes. This game seems to capture some of that magic, that sense of connection without words, just pure interaction and shared experience on this tiny digital world.
You know what this reminds me of? It's like the web gaming equivalent of an art house film. Some people are going to absolutely love it and see it as this transcendent experience. Others are going to walk out halfway through because they can't deal with the shaky cam. And honestly, both reactions are totally valid. The fact that this is generating such passionate discussion, both positive and negative, tells you the developer is doing something right. Nobody writes paragraphs about mediocre games. They've clearly pushed some boundaries here, even if the execution isn't perfect for everyone. And doing this all as a WebGL game that runs in a browser, that's the kind of project that pushes the entire web platform forward, showing what's possible when you really lean into modern web technologies. And that's our top 10 stories from Hacker News this week, folks. What a journey we've been on, from the degradation of Google search and YouTube's war on downloaders to AI spam overwhelming maintainers and the EU's surveillance overreach. We've explored the decline of small organizations, wrestled with life wisdom from a 90-year-old tech pioneer, debated whether to keep inviting Anna, and witnessed the digital erasure of Iranian developers. We exposed bogus security theater from the Secret Service and ended with a beautiful, if controversial, WebGL game about delivering messages on a tiny planet. What strikes me about this week's stories is how they all seem to be wrestling with the same fundamental tension: the promise of technology versus its reality. We were told the internet would democratize information, but Google is burying real results under ads. We were promised global connection, but developers are being deleted based on their birthplace. We created AI to augment human intelligence, but it's being used to generate garbage that wastes everyone's time. Yet, despite all this, there's still innovation happening, still people building beautiful things like that little WebGL game, still communities forming even as the old institutions crumble.
The conversations on Hacker News this week show a community that's frustrated, yes, but also engaged, thoughtful, and still fighting for a better digital future. If these stories resonated with you, if they made you think, or made you angry, or inspired you to build something better, well, that's exactly what the best of Hacker News does. It holds up a mirror to our industry and asks, is this really the best we can do? Until next week, keep questioning, keep building, and maybe keep inviting Anna. This has been your Hacker News Weekly Roundup for September 21st through 27th, 2025. Thanks for listening.